The night they laughed at me was the same night I found the letter that shouldn't have still been warm. I stood in the middle of my sister's dining room, holding a paper plate of food I hadn't eaten a bite of, listening to my brother-in-law tell the story of how I lost my restaurant like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. 22 years old and already washed up, he said, raising his glass like a toast. My mother laughed. My sister laughed. Even my own son laughed, because he was 14 and didn't know any better, because everyone else in that room was laughing too. And children learn cruelty from the people they trust the most. I stood there in a blouse I'd ironed 3 times, because it was the nicest thing I still own. And I smiled, because that's what you do when you have nothing left but your dignity. You smile, and you let them believe they've won. What none of them knew was that 2 hours earlier, before I'd even put on that blouse, a letter had appeared on my kitchen table. Not delivered, not mailed. Appeared, sitting there on top of unopened bills, in handwriting I recognized instantly, even though the woman who wrote it had been dead for 29 years. My grandmother Eleanor's handwriting, small and slanted, the ink so fresh it smudged faintly under my thumb when I touched it, though the paper itself was yellowed and brittle with age, as if it had been waiting somewhere dark for 3 decades and had only just been allowed to surface. I'd read 4 words before my hands started shaking. They lied about me. I folded it, put it in my pocket, and drove to a party, where my own family was waiting to remind me exactly how small they thought I was, not knowing that something had already begun, stirring, in the space between the living and whatever Eleanor had become. If you've ever felt a room go cold around you for no reason, if you've ever caught something moving at the edge of your vision that wasn't there when you turned to look, you already understand what that night was building toward. My name is Marianne, and this channel is called Legacy Whisper, because every family has one, a secret nobody talks about, a truth buried so deep that everyone assumes it's finally stopped breathing. It hadn't. Hit subscribe before we go further, because what happened over the next 6 weeks is the kind of story you don't want to be alone in the dark for. Trust me, 3 months before that dinner, I had a restaurant, 28 seats, a chalkboard menu, a kitchen I built with 9 years of saved wages from double shifts as a line cook, then a sous chef, then finally, the owner of my own place. I named it after my daughter, Ren, who died when she was 6, and every dish on that menu was something I imagined she would have loved. My family called it reckless from the start. My mother told me I was setting myself up to fail. My sister Denise called it a hobby with a business license. I opened Ren's table anyway, and for 18 months, it worked. Then my landlord sold the building. My new lease came with a rent hike. I couldn't survive. My supplier raised prices the same month my walk-in cooler died. And within 4 months, I'd lost everything. My savings, the loan my late mother-in-law had given me, my apartment above the restaurant. I moved into my son Caleb's old bedroom at my mother's house, sleeping under a shelf of his childhood trophies, and started noticing things I told myself were exhaustion. A cold patch of air by the closet that never quite left. The bathroom mirror fogging at 3 in the morning when nothing in the room was warm enough to fog it. A voice, once, so faint I convinced myself it was the pipes, saying a single word into the dark. Wait, there was one more thing I never told anyone, something I only half believed myself until much later. My mother kept a box of old photographs on the top shelf of the hallway closet, family pictures nobody ever looked at, and one night, unable to sleep, I pulled it down just to have something to do with my hands. Near the bottom was a photo of Eleanor I'd never seen before, taken on the porch of the Charleston house, her arm around a much younger version of my mother. Except in the photograph, Eleanor wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking directly at whoever was standing behind it, her expression flat and unreadable, and stapled to the back of the photo, in ink that hadn't existed the last time anyone could have written on it, were 3 words, "She knows now." I put the photo back in the box so fast, I nearly dropped the whole thing, and I didn't open that closet again for 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone about the mirror, or the cold spot, or the voice, or the photograph. You don't, in a family like mine. You learn early that anything you can't prove will be used as more evidence that you're the unstable one, the dramatic one, the one who can't be trusted to run her own life, let alone a restaurant. So I said nothing and I went to Denise's dinner, and I stood there smiling while they laughed. With a letter in my pocket that I hadn't even had the courage to fully unfold yet. I read the rest of it in my car that night, engine off. Streetlight flickering above the windshield in a way that made the shadows in the back seat seem to lean forward every time it dimmed. The letter told me to go to a law office downtown, an address I'd never heard of, for a firm I'd never heard of, and ask for a man named Harold Bess. It told me my grandmother had left something behind that my family never knew existed, and that if I didn't come looking soon, it wouldn't wait for me the way it had waited for her. I want you to understand something about my grandmother, Eleanor. She died when I was 9, and the story my mother always told was that Eleanor left nothing behind but debt and a broken down house that got sold within a year to cover her funeral costs. That was the story, repeated so many times it became a kind of scripture. Eleanor had nothing. Eleanor left nothing. Don't ask about Eleanor. Nobody in my family ever explained why the subject made my mother's jaw tighten every single time it came up, or why, when I was small, she used to check under my bed some nights, whispering to the empty dark like she was negotiating with it. I found Harold Bess's office 2 days later, exactly where the letter said it would be, though when I mentioned the letter itself, he went very still. "There's no letter on file from your grandmother," he said carefully. "Nothing physical has been sent to you. Not from this office." I showed him the paper anyway. He held it at arm's length, like it might do something, and when he finally set it down, his hand wasn't quite steady. "This is her handwriting," he said. "I recognize it from the original trust documents. But Mrs. Bryce died in 1997. This paper is old, but the ink isn't." He told me a story that reframed everything. In 1994, my grandmother had quietly purchased a parcel of coastal land outside Charleston under her maiden name, Eleanor Bryce, separate from the house everyone knew about. She'd placed it in a trust, naming a single beneficiary, not my mother, not my aunt, but the first grandchild who would build something out of nothing, the way I once had to. The trust sat forgotten for decades until a routine audit surfaced. Harold told me the land, now caught in Charleston's coastal development boom, was worth just under $2 million. But he also told me something else, something he admitted he'd never said aloud to a client before. Eleanor's original file included a clause his predecessor had labeled. In the margin, with a single unsettling note, she asked that this remain unresolved until the family's true nature reveals itself. She said she would know when that time came, even from where she'd gone. I didn't cry in his office. I waited until I was in my car, both hands on the wheel, before I let myself fall apart, not from joy, but from the sheer wrongness of a letter that shouldn't exist. Written by a woman who'd been in the ground for almost 30 years. Somehow finding its way to my kitchen table hours before I needed it most. When I told my mother about the inheritance 2 weeks later, she went pale in a way I'd never seen. Not surprised pale, guilty pale. The color draining from her face like something behind her eyes had recognized a threat. She admitted, standing rigid in her kitchen, that she'd known Eleanor bought land under her maiden name. That Eleanor mentioned it once at a Christmas dinner decades ago. And that my mother had spent years quietly searching for it, hoping to claim it for herself before anyone else found it. She never explained why she'd told everyone, including me, that Eleanor died with nothing. She changed the subject instead, the way she always did. Except this time, as she turned away from me, every light in her kitchen flickered once, in perfect unison, and stayed dimmed for exactly as long as her silence lasted. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever discovered that a story your family told you your whole life, repeated so often you never thought to question it, was a lie someone built on purpose, and kept alive for decades because the truth was inconvenient? And have you ever felt, in the moment that lie finally cracked open, like something in the room noticed too? If either of those things has happened to you, tell me in the comments. Because I think more people carry this kind of quiet haunting than we ever admit. The land sat in probate for another month. and during that month, my family's behavior shifted in ways I hadn't expected. Denise started calling more. My mother started inviting me to dinner again, setting a place for me at the good end of the table instead of the folding chair by the kitchen door. But something else started shifting too. I began seeing Eleanor not clearly, not like a figure you could point to, but glimpsed in reflections that held her outline a half-second too long. In a rocking chair at my mother's house that creaked back and forth on nights when every window was shut. I wasn't afraid of her. I understood, somehow, in the way you understand things in dreams, that she wasn't here to frighten me. She was here to watch. She was waiting to see what the people around me would do now that they believed I had something worth taking. Denise called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice light and casual in a way that immediately put me on alert. "I've been thinking," she said, "since the land will be worth so much once it's developed, maybe it makes sense to sell it and split it fairly between all of us as a family." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, because Eleanor had named one specific beneficiary, me, by name, in a document precise enough that Harold said it would survive any legal challenge. I asked Denise, gently, why she believed redistributing it was fair. "Because we're family," she said. "Because it feels wrong for one person to have all of it when everyone struggled." I thought about the folding chair by the kitchen door. I thought about my son laughing at my failure, because the adults around him had taught him laughing was allowed. I thought about my mother's kitchen going dark around her guilt. And I told Denise no. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I thought it had dropped. When she spoke again, her warmth was gone. "You've always been selfish," she said. "Even after everything Mom did for you." She hung up before I could ask what exactly that was supposed to mean. I found out later, from Denise herself, weeks after everything had settled, that something happened in her house that same night. She'd been getting ready for bed when the bathroom faucet turned on by itself, full blast, cold water running for almost a full minute before she managed to shut it off with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. When she turned around, the mirror above the sink had fogged completely, every inch of it, even though the water had been ice cold and there was no reason for any condensation at all, and drawn into the fog in careful, deliberate lines, like someone had traced it slowly with one finger, was a shape she swore for the rest of her life. Looked exactly like the porch railing from Eleanor's old Charleston house, a place Denise had visited exactly once, as a child, and never spoken about since. She didn't tell me that part until much later, her voice dropping low even over the phone, like she was afraid saying it too loudly might invite something back into the room with her. That same week, my mother stopped sleeping with the closet door open, something she'd done every night of my entire childhood, because she said the dark inside frightened her more when she couldn't see into it. She started keeping it shut instead, and locked, and when I asked her why, she wouldn't answer me. She just pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and looked, for the first time in my life, genuinely afraid of something in her own home. That night, alone in Caleb's old room, I woke at 3 in the morning to the temperature dropping so fast I could see my own breath. The closet door, which I always kept shut, stood open onto darkness that seemed thicker than it should have been, and in it, for just a moment, I saw Eleanor clearly for the first time. Not frightened, not monstrous, just tired. The way you look after carrying something heavy for far too long. She didn't speak. She simply raised one hand and pointed, past me, toward the hallway, toward my mother's closed bedroom door. And then she was gone, and the room was warm again. And I understood that whatever truth Eleanor had been protecting for 30 years was about to surface, whether my family wanted it to or not. Harold Bess called 2 days later with the second piece of it. While finalizing probate, his office uncovered something buried in Eleanor's original trust file, a personal letter sealed decades ago, meant to be delivered only once the land transferred into my hands. Except, Harold said, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him, the letter wasn't in the file when he checked it that morning. It had simply appeared on his desk, on paper that matched Eleanor's original documents exactly, the ink still faintly wet. He read me a portion of it. Eleanor wrote that she'd watched, over years of family dinners, How differently people treated me compared to my sister, a granddaughter who worked twice as hard for half the recognition, who apologized for existing at a table that was rightfully hers. She left the land to me because she believed I was the only one who would build something meaningful with it, instead of simply consuming it. And then she wrote the truth that would expose everything. Years earlier, Eleanor had offered my mother a chance to invest in a business opportunity together. My mother declined, calling it too risky, then went behind Eleanor's back and tried to secure that same opportunity for herself alone, cutting Eleanor out entirely only for the deal to collapse. When the other investors discovered my mother didn't have the capital she'd claimed, Eleanor never confronted her. She simply began making different decisions about her estate. And the letter said she made a promise to herself that she would not rest. The word Eleanor actually used was stay, until that betrayal was spoken aloud in the same house where it happened. I sat in my car outside Harold's office and understood, finally, what Eleanor had been waiting for. Not revenge. Witness. She had stayed, in whatever form the dead stay, refusing to move on until the truth she'd carried alone for 30 years was finally allowed to breathe. I invited my mother and Denise to lunch. Not a confrontation, just lunch, at a small public cafe. I told them about the letter. I read them. The part about the failed investment, about my mother's dishonest, about the deal that collapsed because of her own lies. My mother's face drained of color for the second time in 2 months. And this time there was nowhere to redirect the conversation, because the words were in front of her, undeniable, written by a woman who had apparently refused to let death end the argument. That's not what happened, my mother said, her voice thin, and as she said it, the lights above our table dimmed for just a moment. The whole cafe noticed other tables looking up before steadying again, as if something had leaned in close to listen, and then, satisfied, pulled back. My mother's coffee cup, sitting untouched in front of her, rippled once across its surface, the way water does when something heavy has just been set down nearby. Except nothing had touched the table, and no one near us had moved. She flinched like she'd been struck. I watched her eyes dart past my shoulder, toward the empty chair beside me, the one nobody was sitting in, and whatever she saw there, or thought she saw, drained the last of the color from her face, until she looked almost as pale as the letter itself. Then tell me what happened, I said. Because right now, all I have is a letter from a woman who never lied to me once, describing exactly why she made the choice she made. And apparently, she's not finished making sure I hear it. My mother had no other version. Denise, to her credit, sat quietly, watching 30 years of family scripture rearrange itself in real time. She called me alone that week and apologized in a way that felt different. Not designed to get something, just honestly uncomfortable. I laughed at that dinner because everyone else was laughing, she said. I didn't think about what it would feel like from your side of the table. I'm sorry. 6 weeks after that lunch, the land sale closed. I kept a portion of it and used the rest to open a second, bigger Wren's table, built on ground that couldn't be pulled out from under me by a landlord's whim or a broken cooler at the worst possible moment. I put a small plaque near the entrance with Eleanor's name on it. The night before we opened, I slept in the empty dining room, and for the last time, I felt that familiar cold settle beside me, gentle now instead of urgent, patient in a way that told me the waiting was finally over. I never saw her again after that night, not clearly. The mirrors stopped fogging. The rocking chair at my mother's house sat still. But sometimes, late at night, long after the restaurant closes, and the last chair gets stacked on the last table, I'll catch the porch light outside flickering once, twice, then, holding steady, and I'll swear, just for a second, that I can smell my grandmother's rosewater perfume drifting through a kitchen she never once set foot in while she was alive. I don't check the closets anymore when that happens. I just say thank you, out loud, to whatever's still listening, and I go on locking up for the night. Caleb helped me paint the walls the weekend before we opened. At one point, he looked up and said, "I'm sorry I laughed that night. I didn't understand." I told him the most important thing wasn't what he'd done that night, but what he chose to do. Now that he understood better, my mother came to the opening, standing near the back, and sure of her welcome, and I walked over and gave her a plate of food myself. Because whatever she'd done, whatever she still hadn't fully owned, Eleanor had taught me that grace doesn't require forgetting the truth. It just requires choosing what you do with it. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: the people who laugh at you during your lowest moment are rarely laughing because they see you clearly. They're laughing because it's easier than confronting what your struggle reveals about their own choices. And sometimes, the truth that exposes them doesn't stay buried just because the person who knew it has been gone for 30 years. Sometimes, it waits. Sometimes, it finds a way to stay a little longer. In the cold spot by a closet door, in a letter that shouldn't still be warm, until someone finally hears it. If this story gave you chills, tell me in the comments which moment got you the most. I read every single one, and your stories are usually the reason I find the next one to tell. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way back to the surface, share this with them tonight. Until next time, this has been Legacy Whisper, and I'll see you in the next story.